Hello, welcome to Old Stuff Show. This is part two in the program called Oh What Memories. In the first part, you recall me saying that I interviewed some 80 older Londoners and put their memories in two books. This was the part one, which sold 6,000 copies at the time in 1987. And this one, part two, which was done in 1994, and I still have lots of copies of that. And these actually will be on eBay. And one thing to remember is that the memories, although they're in one community, are basically universal. So wherever you live, you'll be able to identify with a lot of these memories that you may have heard or experienced yourself. One of my favorite activities back then was to interview the older people. I have some 250 hours of audio recording, and it's just an amazing experience to hear these people tell their stories and give me their advice, and they were just terrific. And often they would say, "I'm sorry I didn't give you anything important," but they didn't realize that it was absolutely important. And so preserving memories is like preserving the history of ordinary people, which many people forget about. And sometimes you wonder if all these are true. They're maybe a little exaggerated, or memories fade somewhat. But we take it for what it is, and usually it's pretty close to the truth and very entertaining. So what I plan to do is continue on with some variety of stories out of these books, and give you some ideas about what people were going through in their life in those days. And we'll just have a little fun talking about some of this stuff. So nothing in any particular order. I'm just picking and choosing here. So one comment that was made here was a person said, I worked with a chap who was a milkman for the Pure Milk Company. He said that around Christmas time the customers would give him a shot of whiskey or whatever. And one time he got so drunk that he couldn't deliver and didn't know which way to go. But the horse knew and took him home because the horse knew the route. So I told that story of the smart horse also in the last program. But the milkman, the delivery of the milkman, this photo of the horse-driven milk wagon was typical in the 1940s, 50s. The bread man, the milkman, the iceman, so many deliveries were made directly to the home that life was a little different in those days. So that fellow had an interesting experience for sure. During the Depression, another person says, we rented a brand new house for $38 a month. Those figures sound pretty cheap, but we have to consider, inflation and time, and equating it with today, it probably is somewhat the same. But many people could not afford to live in their own home, and so they had to rent. The Depression was a topic that many people talked about. Times were tough. I remember my mother saying that when they lived on the farm, they grew potatoes, and it was not uncommon for people at night to come by and steal their potatoes so that they'd have something to eat. I live in a university town, and so I got some interesting stories about the local experience here at the university. One lady who was in charge of some of the social aspects of it, she says the worst crisis we ever had at our university convocation was the Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, with him when he was supposed to be a guest speaker at the graduation. She says he was furious because we were supposed to meet him at one railway station, but there were two, and they went to the wrong railway station to pick him up. And when he arrived, nobody was there, so he took a taxi and went up to the president's house. But then the president sent him up to the university. And so here was the president of the Prime Minister of Canada being pushed around a little bit, and it seems kind of interesting that he didn't have bodyguards or anything like we would expect today. So I remember too in Canada especially, Prime Minister security was not always very, very heavy. I can remember shopping one time in Toronto, maybe in the 70s, I'm not sure, and the Prime Minister Joe Clark was doing some Christmas shopping in one of the department stores, and I saw him in the distance in the record department, and he was standing there all by himself, going through records. I could have easily gone up to him and talked to him, but didn't want to bother him. And so times have changed in that respect. Life was just a little more secure and tame in those days. I like this story of this gentleman. He was in his 90s. He told me about living across the river from the Carling Brewery here in the city. That picture up there is the old Carling Brewery. London, Ontario, Canada, was somewhat like the Milwaukee of the North, because both the Labatt Brewery and the Carling Brewery, many people don't know that both of them were founded in London. The Carling Brewery burned down and moved to Toronto, and the Labatt Brewery is still here in the city. So this gentleman is telling me this story, and he said he lived across the river from the Carling Brewery, and he would take his horses over there to get water and in the river, and then he noticed that there was a tap on the side of the brewery with a mug hanging on it, and he said that anybody could help themselves to a mug of beer, and so it was very cold, and in the hot weather he would get a few things of water in the river, and then he would have a beer. But he was only 12 years old, so nothing was said, and that was just a favorite memory that he had of living in the right place at the right time. The family life in those days were pretty interesting and so different. On this page here, we hear that story about somebody being sick, and everybody seemed to have to help. When my father took sick, this person said the generosity of the people was amazing. In 1941, when my father was in the hospital, the school sent home a basket of stuff for us at Christmas. Then my uncle showed up at the door with 2 chickens for us. Then another knock came at the door, and it was the church with a big basket of food. And then another knock came, and the head of the union of Labatt's, where his dad worked, a big hamper of food and toys was delivered. So it was one of the best Christmases she ever had, she says. But people were very, very generous, and they were very concerned about helping other people if they needed that help. That's one of the better memories is before electricity, and none of us would remember that time. She remembers the man coming around in the morning to trim all of the lamps, so the streets had oil lamps, fill them up, and get ready for the night. They then had to come around at night to light them, and so that's an unusual thing, but people remembered that at that particular time. One other person says, we had a washing machine on the farm when I was young. There was no electricity then, and before we went to school, we had to help with the washing machine. Required 2 people to push the levers, and we all had to take our turn before we went to school. It's perhaps like this one here. So manual labor wasn't easy to do some of the basic things that we just press a button to do today. Manners. Generosity, manners. When children were with adults, this person says, it was mannerly not to say anything. We just sat there. You were not to talk unless spoken to. So I remember when we had company for Sunday dinner, she says, we kids all sat in the kitchen while the adults sat in the dining room. We weren't allowed in there. Our table was set for us, and we ate what was on it. We wouldn't interrupt them at all, so kids knew their place, and everybody had to do what they were told. Propriety. I remember a lady telling me too that her father in the house. She never saw her father in the house without shoes. because that just didn't seem to be right at the time. So, depression again. My mother would buy 10 pounds of sausage at 5 cents a pound, she says, and we had sausage in 52 different varieties. My mother never used a cookbook, but she was a good cook, so you had to make do, and you had to improvise to make food a little interesting in the Depression times. Another person says, I can remember my mother telling me about women wearing their long dresses, and this is a story I don't know if it's true, but anyways, it's always entertaining to listen to these folks tell yarns like this. And she said there was a lady at church one night that had a terrible experience. When she got home after church, she found that she had squashed a mouse that happened to go up under her dress during the service. So I guess that's the problem of wearing the long dresses, the long skirts in those days. You didn't know what was going to happen. This person says, when we were on the farm on Sundays, we returned from church, and the family would gather around the piano to sing old songs or hymns. We had to make our own fun in those days. We often went for walks and looked for puffballs. We shelled the nuts, and my mother would put them in homemade pie from the beech nuts that we would find. So the story of gathering around the piano is very common. I know in this province, in Ontario, or I'm sorry, in this southern part of Ontario, there were 22 piano making companies, and pianos were a big deal. It's quite different today. People don't seem to be taking to piano lessons like they used to, but sheet music, pianos, that was entertainment that people could enjoy in those days. I drove down highway one day a couple of years ago, and I saw this old piano at the end of a driveway, and there's a big sign on it that said free. So people don't know how to get rid of the pianos when they don't need them anymore. Another person here said, my dad never owned a car, and that's an interesting thing in society because they couldn't afford it, of course. And my mother didn't have a refrigerator when she passed away in 1946, and they got furniture just before the war. A bathtub was not put into the house until 1937 or 38. We had a cousin who was a tinsmith, and he made us a great big galvanized tub. It looked like a bathtub, but the trouble was you had to fill it with a kettle and then bail it out when it wasn't hooked up to any plumbing. We didn't think it was a hardship, she says, then. It's only now that you realize that it was. So life was not easy. You had to do a lot of manual work, and refrigerators weren't the thing then. Ice boxes were, and that's another kind of peddler that came around to the home, the Iceman, to fill the ice box up maybe every 2 or 3 days. That's how you kept your food cold. One of the other peddlers was, this lady says, the fish man. And the fish man would blow his horn, and the fish was packed in ice and weighed on a scale, and you would go out to the street if you wanted to buy it, and they would weigh it, and that was how you bought your fish. There was also, she says, the coffee and tea man who came to the house. He came in a car during the 1930s. He came every 2 or 3 weeks. We never bought it from the store, but always from this man. As well, a vegetable man came around. He sold bananas and fresh fruits. He came once a week. That's so different from going to the grocery store as we do whenever we want. Here's another one about helping people. Also, if anyone was sick, my grandmother always took them homemade soup and custards. This was for anybody she knew in the neighborhood. Neighborliness was so important in those days. Now this is very interesting because she said this lady also was called often when deaths happened. At the time, the coffin was brought into the home, and they put a wreath on the door. My grandmother would be called in to wash the corpse and then get them ready for the funeral. Even when I was in high school, this lady says, the coffin would be in the house for 2 or 3 days. That was 40 years ago. Also, people would bring all kinds of food. After the funeral, your immediate relatives would go back to the house. You didn't have a funeral home then. So those people who collect, it's called funerary collectibles, anything related to funeral type items. The body, a picture of the corpse in the parlor is a collectible, believe it or not, and one that's hard to get, but I have seen them myself, and so that's a little bit unusual. School, of course, I mentioned school in other programs, mentioned the strap. That was a common memory for a lot of these people. They got the strap for just about anything, and the strap was it hurt badly when you got it. Schools like this one here, two-room schools were very common. You would line up outside. There was often a boys' entrance and a girls' entrance. And this lady says, when we came in from lining up outside, I or someone else would play marching music on the piano. Students would come in and go up the stairs to the music. Can you imagine? At school. They marched in single file to their classrooms. So there was no gyms in the school. You did your exercises in the hallways, and it was just whatever the facility offered. So the two-room school, like the one I showed you, was typical of that kind of thing. And now you see many of these two-room schools or one-room schools being turned into homes out in the country. This person said that there was no work during the Depression, and because of that, there was a young boy who was at her school, and she says, when I was there, he repeated grade 9 7 times because he had nothing else he could do. He was the only student I knew that drove his own car to school. He was just putting in time. He was 20 years old, and that must be a record, she says. But kids driving cars to school, relatively common today. So, you know, it's if in the old days you drove a car to school, that was a pretty exciting thing to be able to do. And the strap, Mr. Knight, this lady said, was sometimes strap students in the classroom. The class was real good after that, so I'm sure it was. And I remember a lady telling me a story too, and it's kind of a sad one, that she remembers somebody being strapped on the bare butt in front of the class at the front of the room. And I can't imagine what would happen to a teacher who would do that sort of thing in today's world, but it wasn't a problem in those days. The teacher had authority and used it whatever way they wanted to. So I have mentioned to you the importance of recording memories of relatives. I think that that's an important part of your family archives, and you should do that before anyone passes away, if they're older. In this case, I was doing memories of the community, which they're preserved for future generations. The first book, I'm sure that when I did it in '87, that these people, all of these people have passed away. So the book really does capture the memories of the community and those people in those days, and I'm very happy to be able to contribute to that. So memories are an important part of history. We tend in history to focus on the story of kings and queens and generals and wars and things like that, but the life of the everyday person is something too that can be remembered, and it contributes to the social history and something worth saving. So that wraps up our little storytelling for today. I hope that you learned something, and it's so much fun to be able to talk to these older folks, and I hope that they will do that for you as well, and that future generations will appreciate what we can leave to them because of that. The books part 2 are available. This one I will have on eBay. Do it on a buy it now basis. Put a couple of copies on, and you can pick it up, and it's not that expensive. $15 and shipping. So that's on my eBay site. ID Lonrem, Lonrem. Have a look at it, and if you wish to take a look at it, please do. We're moving along now to program 7 or 8. I'm happy with so far the response. I'd like to keep doing it, and so every Friday we will have a new program added to the list, and like and subscribe if you would, and you'll get a notification when that new program is coming out. But definitely it's going to be on by Friday of each week. So thank you, and we'll look forward to sharing some more information and stories with you in the future. Have a good day.